All right. Hello, everyone. This is CJ with Rogue Money Radio. I am very excited today. To say excited is probably an understatement, but today's guest, who really doesn't need any introduction, is Jim Willie. Jim is a statistical analyst in marketing research and retail forecasting. Jim has a PhD in statistics. Jim is the editor of the Hat Trick Letter that you can find on www.goldenjackass.com. So, Jim, how are you, sir?
I'm doing just fit and fiddle, and I'm doing fine.
Excellent,
We
excellent.
have we actually have a break here. It's been about 10 days with almost no rain in Costa Rica, and we're in the middle of the rainy season. So it's really nice to see the sunset. Afternoon of sun, and get out there and take a walk, take the hat off, take the shirt off. Anyway, I'm doing fine. Spirits are good, and we got so much happening now, and if you're looking for a list of key events, key factors, it's hard to make the list under 15 items. 15. This is a climax of structural breakdown, climax of international conflict with hidden motives. Everything is fracturing. Everything. And it's amazing that so many people are asleep, and their reasoning is so simple, simple-minded. They say, the stock market's doing well. Everything's fine. Right. They don't even know who's buying the stocks.
Exactly, exactly. Well, let's jump right into it because I completely agree. And one of the recent things that occurred, Jim, was we witnessed that the House and the Senate passed new sanctions against Russia. Now we're witnessing some geopolitical pushback from very specific key members of the EU, including Germany. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, gosh, we just had a revelation about a week ago that the Democrat National Committee hired a consulting group to produce the false Russian stories. And that's an amazing incident. There should be arrests, but it doesn't. That's not how things work in the fascist state. It's about power and clinging to power. But this Russian blame game just will not go away, and its roots. I don't want to get sidetracked off the answer, but the roots are simple. The Rothschild family in Europe and England do not want Russia to make tight economic connections with Europe that sustain a financial structure coming into place. Therefore, we had the Ukraine war, which was a State Department, U.S. government State Department project run by Victoria Nuland. It cost $5 billion, and amphetamines played a very important part during the rioting and the coup. But the U.S. fascists, the neocons, neoconservative, why such a nice, sweet name, neoconservative? Gee, that sounds nice. It's neo-Nazi. It's fascist. These are the fascists. And it's amazing. Americans cannot define fascism. My brother doesn't recognize the fascism, and he has a Phi Beta Kappa degree in economics and political science. I say to him, John, you don't recognize the fascist state? Well, not really. Okay, so the U.S. government decided to take one more step and to impose sanctions on Germany and its companies involved with the Russian Gazprom gas pipeline called Nord Stream 2 that goes under the Baltic Sea, and parts of it in the winter are frozen. So this is an underwater supply line from Russia to German industry. Germany needs this for their industry. So the U.S. said any company involved in the construction or the finance of Nord Stream 2 is going to be subject to sanctions and fines by the U.S. government. I have a very simple question. Since when does Washington have jurisdiction over the German state?
Exactly.
They don't. Therefore, Germany is now pushing back, saying, wait a minute. First, you tell us a couple months ago that we have to pay bigger bills for NATO, so we'd rather back down on our obligations for NATO. Now you're overstepping your bounds by saying you're going to fine our German companies for being involved with finance construction of Nord Stream 2. We're going to say foul, and we're going to start sanctioning your American companies in Germany doing business if they do anything we dislike. So now what we've got is a realization coming to pass of a forecast I made about 2 years ago, maybe a little like 18 months ago, 2 years ago. I said eventually the key European member nations will ignore the sanctions against Russia. They'll just go ahead and do what they think is the right thing to do for the betterment of their economy and financial system, to preserve jobs, to keep their economy running. And here's where it gets absurd. The United States is saying to the Germans, take U.S. gas supply. It will cost more, and it's inadequate in volume, but we're friends. Now, that's just lunatic. The Germans are saying, no, we don't want to pay more, and you don't have adequate volume, so get out of our face. Okay, now, what's the upshot? Bigger level. Germany is realizing the United States and their fascists are trying to run Europe and run Germany into the ground. The German companies don't like the trade union that Obama tried to promote, the transatlantic trade partnership. And the result is going to be more formal and developed ties with contracts and agreements and cultural exchange and the whole works between Russia and Germany. There's been significant damage to the trade, but the German companies have done something clever in the last 3 years. They set up subsidiaries. Pardon my voice. I'm believe it or not, it's been over 2 months since this flu and bronchitis. I'm doing very well now, but I've got a little bit of alteration to my throat, and I'm hoping that things get back to normal, with phlegm levels and raspiness and need to clear the throat. My voice is not 100%, my throat's not 100%, but my brain is doing just fine. The Germans and Russians are going to continue their trade, they're going to develop it, and they're going to move away from something that the Germans did in the last 3 years in reaction. They set up subsidiaries inside Russia, so that the German Mittelschaft company, they would build stuff and produce stuff in Russia and send it to their Russian clients. It did not have to cross a border. So there was nothing illegal about setting up subsidiaries in Russia. The only obstructions was with trade. Another hole in the sanctions. My God, the biggest hole in sanction history was the Obama idiots who set up the Iran sanctions and said that the Iran central bank could not receive funds from European companies or countries, like with oil trade. But they left out the big Iranian banks. So the big Iranian banks took the gold that India sent them for the Iranian oil. And the Indians sent it to the big Iranian banks, which passed it on to the central bank. Again, Obama was an idiot in foreign policy, and every single foreign policy initiative has backfired and turned into a massive failure, despite all the chest pounding and hoopla. Okay, so the German sanctions, they also include Iran and North Korea, but I don't want to get into all that. That's just really silly, moronic stuff. But the sanctions that the Congress put about 3 weeks ago versus Russia are going to result in the Germans building up more trade, building up more contracts, building up more dual relationships, and continuing with the pipeline, ignoring the sanctions, probably threatening sanctions against the United States, companies in some way. The agents doing bidding for Washington neocon fascists. And it could actually bring about the fracture and splintering off of nations within NATO. We've already got the beginning of that with Turkey. The Incirlik Air Force Base is no longer a NATO base. All the planes and assets, I love how they use the word assets. That's nuclear bombs.
Right.
All the assets have been moved back to Germany, and there's a rift between the Germans and the Turks right now over the failed U.S.-led coup against President Erdogan of Turkey, another failed foreign initiative. Oh gosh, so we got the German situation, and it is turning into a real mess. And here's what I predict. The U.S. is going to back down. The U.S. is going to back down and say, okay, you want to go ahead with your Nord Stream 2 construction finance. You want to supply your German industries with Russian gas. It's your decision. It's okay by us. In other words, we tried to pound down your throat something and it didn't work, and we're walking away from the room with our tail between our legs. Very interesting how the fascists not only destroy their host, namely the U.S. economy, they destroy their relationships with all allies. The process well along.
The arrogance of the arrogance of the United States in regards to these sanctions, and we know in part, the largest part probably is in regards to the Russian interventions in Syria. And let's talk about the dynamics, Jim, of a post 9/11 Middle East and the United States involvement, and if you want to walk us through those events and leading up to what we're witnessing currently happening there with Qatar and the Saudis and the chaos that the United States has created.
Okay. Obama thought it would be a good idea to disrupt all the Muslim and Arab nations. This is what we do. We don't leave nations alone. We try to interfere with their internal politics. Can you imagine Iran, Russia, China, and lots of other nations getting involved with the Democrats and backing candidates and bringing in straw figures and funding riots, and oh my gosh, we would cry foul. But that's what we do every single day, and we kill potential leaders like Campos in Brazil, because he looked like he was going to become president of Brazil, and we didn't like that. So he had a small plane accident, and he's dead. Okay, so Obama thought it would be a good idea to do what he called the Arab Spring. We had the color revolutions in Eastern Europe, most of which were a failure. And now we had, in the last 8 years, we had the Arab Spring revolutions. I have one contact with government experience, and he told me something. He said, Jim, this is a better way of interpreting the Arab Springs. What they do is they try to disrupt the governments, disrupt the monarchies, disrupt the economy, and try to force the government to move their central bank gold. And once they start moving it, the Bush family comes in to steal it. That's one of the interpretations of Arab Spring. Get movement, steal the gold. How'd that work out in Ukraine? Very well. That's not an Arab Spring example. But within 1 month of the coup in Kiev, Ukraine, they moved their 44 tons of gold to New York. They'll never see it again. Okay, so the Arab Spring, it was, Egypt, that was a failure. Now they're kind of buddies with Russia, developing their trade, building up nuclear power plants with Rosatom help from Russia. The American puppet was displaced, pushed out, and a pro-Eastern figure is running Egypt. Move on to Libya, where we funded the revolt there, and the little-known fact is that Gaddafi wanted to develop the gold dinar and have all North African oil sales to the West paid in the Arab gold dinar currency. And anytime the dollar is challenged in such a big way, leaders are killed and nations are invaded. And we bring up the sectarian violence nonsense excuse and the internal violence and destabilization. The United States is coming in to save the day. Yeah. Okay, so Libya is now a nation in chaos without leadership. And from what I'm hearing, the anti-West factions are taking control. It doesn't mean they're going to start selling oil for, gold. It just means there's going to be a lot more trouble for the Western leaders to bring Libya to heel. All right, move on. And the United States fully cooperated with Saudi to start a Yemen war because the Saudis are pretty much out of oil. Now, you don't read about that in the New York Times, that rag, or CNN, that rag. But Yemen is on the same Arabian Peninsula as Saudi Arabia. I mean, wouldn't you expect, say, Canada and large parts like the eastern provinces to share geology with the northeast and central states of the United States? Yeah, of course. All right, so the Saudis have been lying about their spare capacity, lying about their excess reserves. I'm talking about oil. And wherever you have oil, you have gas, because it's kind of, Mutt and Jeff there. They work together, they appear together, they live together, they develop together. So the United States said to the Saudis, go ahead, buy some more weapons from the U.S. military establishment, have your war in Yemen, and we'll help you to bomb hospitals and schools and marketplaces. Then the United States organized something with the Saudis to pay a bribe to the United Nations to look the other way on war crimes. Now we're doing some phony arms deals with the Saudis. Remember 2 months ago, Trump went to Saudi Arabia with a lot of hoopla, fanfare, and orchestras and red carpet and a lot of bullshit, and announced these new arms deals. I immediately wrote an article pointing out 3 or 4 potential realities behind the deal, and some of my ideas were correct, and one I overlooked. All the arms deals were done by Obama, and there was nothing new. So, the United States is part of and accomplice to war crimes in Yemen, and I've come to learn something else recently, that the Saudis bought a P4 level laboratory to spread cholera by airplane drops.
Wow.
So now you have perhaps 1 million victims of cholera in Yemen, and the United States doesn't say anything. Okay, that's one of the other Arab Springs. Not really, but it involved Yemen, which is an Arab and a Muslim country, and they're victims from actions from one of the U.S. allies. Okay, the most recent one is Qatar. I don't care how it's supposed to be pronounced. I call it Qatar. I mean, they call it Qatar. I don't know, Qatar. This is not the television show with John Travolta in it. From the 70s. This is Qatar, Qatar.
Right.
and what you have going here is an extreme deviation from 2 strong U.S. allies and supporters of Treasury bonds for 30 or 40 years, namely the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates, UAE. UAE is basically Abu Dhabi city-state and Dubai, the city-state. Okay, the it's MBS and MBZ. Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi, and Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, which is more dominant in the UAE than Dubai. Dubai is kind of a financial center, and Abu Dhabi is where all the rich guys live who call the shots and manage huge sovereign wealth funds, or what used to be huge. Anyway, MBS and MBZ decided that their war wasn't going real well in Yemen, so they're going to set their sights on Qatar, because Qatar doesn't have much in the way of defense. They got a very developed liquefied natural gas sector, and what they overlooked was that they have tight Russian connections due to the LNG, and they have tight German connections due to the technology influence, like consultants in their LNG sector. And the real weird wrinkle with Qatar is the United States has a Central Command Center, Central Command Control Center, CENTCOM, much like they have in Tampa, Florida. And the CENTCOM in Qatar controls all U.S. military activity in the Middle East, including Syria, but also Ukraine, and also Afghanistan. So it's kind of a big CENTCOM, maybe bigger than Tampa, but Tampa and Nevada is where we have all the controlled drones and all those weapons that are managed by computer screens and killing civilians as long as we possibly get a real target. That's okay. Civilians might grow up to become terrorists. That's the new line of thinking now. So Qatar is not going to bend. Qatar has extensive multi-billion-dollar investments in France and Germany. They're not going to bend. They're not going to just give in and say, all right, whatever you guys in Saudi and UAE want, we'll do, no problem. No, they're going to say, screw off. And now you're seeing the Saudis back down. They had a list of requirements. Now they changed to a list of requests, and now they're calling them points of interest or some silly euphemistic nonsense. Okay. Qatar is critical because they changed their minds and decided not to go any further, not to back and not to invest any further the Saudi gas pipeline. Instead, they're going with the Iranian gas pipeline and will continue their giant project called North Dome by Qataris and called South Pars by the Iranians. It's a gigantic gas deposit in the Persian Gulf, and it will be a key part to the supply line of the Iran gas pipeline that Qatar has signed up with Russian support. Saudi doesn't like that, so they called Qataris terrorist supporters.
Imagine that.
The largest terrorist nation among the Arabs is Saudi. It's so weird now, CJ, that Langley had a deal a year ago, 2 years ago, where a certain prince was lined up to be the crown prince. In other words, when the king dies, the crown prince takes the throne. And Langley had this arrangement. And Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, came in there and upset that understanding and situation and line to the throne. Langley wanted the other prince to remain crown prince because he was not in support of ISIS terrorism, was not in support of exporting like Muslim Brotherhood terrorism to Egypt and other activities in the Arab world. The irony is thick, because ISIS is a Mossad and a Langley project. And Putin revealed that so thoroughly about a year ago at a G7 meeting with a Microsoft PowerPoint dog and pony show of all the finance connections between the U.S., Israelis, and the Swiss banks funding ISIS. So Arab Spring has turned out to be a failure in every single nation. We disrupted their nations. We may have stolen some of their, assets like gold. But every one of the nations now has tighter connections with Russia and China and Iran. So once again, every foreign policy initiative since 9/11 has been a massive failure, an emphatic failure, very much in keeping with the fascist theme. The fascists kill their host, and they wreck their relationships with allies. And it's true with the entire Arab world. The Voice has a simple conclusion. He says, Jim, with the petrodollar going away and decaying step by step until it's going to become a meaningless standard that's not honored anymore, meaning oil is not purchased with treasury bonds or treasury bills anymore. When that happens, he said, just about every single Arab monarch, Arab oil monarchy will fall. And he gives the example of Oman being the only one that does not. I think because they develop good relationships with other nations like Russia, China, and Iran, and also they diversify so they're not overly invested in treasury bonds, the dollar-based government debt. So Arab Spring has been a failure, and most of the nations involved in their disruptions have turned to Russia and China as a more stable player on the geopolitical stage. And that's where we stand today. I think one of the big events coming up, and it could be next week, it could be next month, could be before the year is over, could be, I don't know. I think it's going to be before this year is up. The Chinese are going to win a deal where they are able to pay for Saudi oil in RMB, their domestic currency, and not use the dollar anymore. The Chinese are really angry and irritated that for the last 2 or 3 years, really ever since the Ukraine war and all that nonsense about blaming Russia, the Chinese have been irritated that they are buying oil on the international market and paying dollars. They don't want to use dollars. They're using their treasury bonds to, buy up assets around the world, including U.S. urban commercial properties. You make a list of the top 12 U.S. cities, the Chinese own 30 to 35% of all those cities' urban commercial buildings, commercial properties. So they're very big in there, and they're working closely with Wells Fargo. It's very clever what they're doing. They put up treasury bonds at Wells Fargo and say, we want to borrow 10 times the amount of this collateral. And you think Wells Fargo can say, sorry, your collateral's no good? They're treasury bonds. U.S. government doesn't like it. They can't stop it. So China continues buying up U.S. commercial urban property. Oh, my gosh. So when the Chinese win the right to buy Saudi oil in RMB terms, you can pretty much say, got a handful of nails there to put the coffin nice and shut for the petrodollar.
Bingo.
And that's when I think the shitstorm begins to accelerate in a very noticeable way.
Jim, in regards to the picking up just a tad echo. In regards to the Saudi Aramco IPO, does that even matter anymore in terms of the players? We're watching, London, we're watching the United States all try to wager for this IPO. What direction do you see that IP going in, or does it even matter?
Oh, I think it matters a lot. First of all, it matters with the fraud. Western analysts are very good at putting a value on a proposed IPO. They got a lot of experience. Compare Aramco to Rosneft and Exxon. Okay, that's just for starters. And what they concluded was the Aramco total value is 4 to 5 times less than what the Saudis state. And that does not even factor in the lies on the still available Saudi oil reserves. In other words, they say the company is worth 4 to 5 times less, and they haven't factored in all the oil that's not there in the Saudi deserts. They lie. They've been lying for a long time. In the 2000 decade, in the late 90s, it was Saudi's spare capacity might come online, meaning their existing oil production might start pouring out oil, and that pushes down the oil price without doing anything. In other words, talking down the oil price. Okay, they've been lying for a long time. They don't have the reserves. The Ghawar oil giant, the elephant field, is producing 98% water. It's called the water cut. You know, you pump out oil and you stuff down water to maintain the pressure so you can pump out a little bit more oil in the next year. Okay, the Aramco deal will point out the fraud of the Saudis. And that's very important, because if the fraud is well known, then the dollar is going to take an impact, a hit. Because if the dollar's best friend is the Saudi oil producers and they're declared fraudulent and their reserves are declared as lies, then one more little plank in the petrodollar system is taken away. But here's how I think it's going to be very interesting and full of intrigue. I think the Chinese are going to make an offer for a piece of Aramco. They're only putting up for sale 10% of Aramco. I think the Chinese are going to overpay on a piece of Aramco so that they have leverage later to use it for paying for Saudi oil in RMB terms. They're increasing their leverage every month by buying a little bit less of the Saudi oil. They're buying instead Russian oil and Iranian oil. But if they say to the Saudis, look, we'll buy a nice piece of Aramco and we'll overpay. We don't care if we pay a little bit more than it's worth. That's okay, because we want a good partner in the Persian Gulf, the Gulf region. I still call it the Persian Gulf. All my life I've been calling it the Persian Gulf, but they want to be called the Gulf. Well, there are more than one Gulf in the world. Very narcissistic of the Arabs. I mean, how about the Gulf of Tonkin? No.
Yep.
Anyway, I could go on. So the Chinese are going to use leverage with Aramco to win the right to buy Saudi oil, and they're going to increase their Saudi purchases and pay for it in RMB. There are going to be two consequences from that within the oil world. There are going to be hundreds of consequences generally, geopolitically. Pardon me. I got really dry there.
No, you're fine.
Sorry about that. Other Gulf Arab nations like Kuwait, like Bahrain, like Oman, they're going to say, oh, wait a minute, we don't want to lose any business to China. We'll take RMB too. And then you're going to have the whole Gulf region eventually accepting RMB currency from the Chinese. Okay, that's the seller side. The buyer side is going to be Southeast Asia. Other nations, I'll just make up one, South Korea. South Korea might come forward and say, well, we'd like to buy at least half of the oil from the Gulf region in RMB terms, because we want to diversify out of the treasury bonds in our banking system. And we'd like to have more Chinese bonds because they're neighbors. And we're doing more commerce with China. So we want more Chinese currency, and we like to hold government bonds. So other nations like South Korea, I mean, it could be other little nations like, Singapore, who knows? They're going to come forward and say, we want to hold less of treasury bonds, and we want to buy more Gulf oil in RMB and hold more Chinese government bonds. Okay, so the buyers and the sellers are both going to climb on to whatever the Chinese set up with the Saudis, because the Saudis have competitors and the Chinese have neighbors. Pardon me, I'm dealing with I deal with this every single day on my throat. I'm doing okay, but it's just a dry, raspy throat every day. Okay, so this is very big, and Aramco plays a piece in it because the Chinese might use it as leverage. And they might prevent the Saudis from losing face with declarations of fraud and a failed IPO. Very important. So the Chinese might enter the Arab room on a white horse and help the Saudis out. And I guarantee you, if they get involved with Saudi Arabia with oil sales, they're going to start influencing on the diplomatic level and try to bring down this intensity of war crimes in Yemen.
Correct. Right. Jim, in regards to that, when you take a look at the Saudis' actions in Qatar, do you think that was green lighted by the Trump administration, or at least an advance notice of what their intentions were?
I don't really know. I think the United States, I'm not really sure that the direction of your question there. Is your question, does the United States understand everything the Saudis are doing?
Well, specifically, yeah, in terms of, because I think in part exactly what you just stated is watching a huge Saudi pivot away from the United States to China, and in regards to the IPO and the purchasing, that is probably further going to escalate the events in terms of the demise of the petrodollar and the dollar itself.
Yeah, I think the actions toward Qatar by Saudi and UAE indicate very clearly that the petrodollar is dead. Not that it's, getting weaker. It's dead. It's dead. And further evidence is the OPEC meetings recently and the accord that they had with the Arab men wearing robes in the same room. I hesitate to call it an Arab meeting. I mean, an OPEC meeting, an OPEC conference. It was more like former OPEC members wearing robes showing up in the same room. They made an agreement, and they've not honored it. OPEC is dead. I've been calling OPEC dead ever since September of last year, when they had a meaningless meeting in Vienna to try to reduce output, make an accord, and it failed. So now they make an accord and they don't honor it. What is that, progress? I mean, come on. OPEC's dead. It's been dead for a year. And now the targeting by Saudi and UAE of Qatar is very historic. Just start with the fact that the United States military has a huge base and a central command control center there. So what are they going to do? Overrun the country? Kick out the emir when they have a deal with the U.S. military? Okay, maybe they were hoping that the U.S. military would engineer a coup of the emir in Oman, and it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I think Qatar has way too many strong connections outside of its country, outside of the Arab world. Has Chinese connections with trade, has Russian connections with LNG trade, has German connections with LNG technology, has U.S. military presence. Qatar's not going to bend. What you're going to see is the Saudis are going to bend. They're going to bend so far over that they're going to have to lift their robe and show their hind ends. I don't know exactly what the U.S. and Qatar have agreed to, but it seems like It's a giant nothing that the U.S. is asking of Qatar. Okay, you have all this pressure on Qatar, all these foreign connections showing to Qatar, including multi-billion investments in European companies. What is the message from the U.S. to Qatar? Nothing. What's the message of the U.S. military to Qatar? Nothing. Okay, a very loud nothing, CJ. So, the U.S. tolerance? We're not tolerant of Saudi actions. We're complicit with their military actions. But when it comes to the attempts to isolate and blame Qatar for being terrorists, I don't think the United States played any role at all. The Saudis were on their own, and they went off on a wild spree and have been called on it. Now they're backing down. The Saudis are a disgrace. They're liars in the oil world. They're war criminals in Yemen, and they're fraud kings with Aramco. They're liars for the longest time, and the vengeance. The joke is on them. Okay, I'd like to mention just briefly in closing this particular topic that the Saudis have been running absolutely gigantic trade surpluses based in oil sales for 40 years. Yet we're led to believe they have a mere $160 billion worth of treasury bills, treasury bonds, total U.S. Treasury, total U.S. government bond holdings. I don't think so. No, it's more like 3 to 4 trillion. I mean, can Americans do math anymore?
Wow.
I mean, can you multiply 30 years, which is 360 months? Can you multiply that by, even a simple $100 billion trade surplus from oil in a single year? It's 3 to 4 trillion. So where is it? The TIC report, the Treasury International Capital Report, had a nice little deception in there for the longest time, like 2 decades. They called it OPEC oil exporters, and they put the treasury bond holdings in that category. But last year we decided to separate the Saudis. Well, why was that? I have a simple explanation. Because the petrodollar is dead. The Saudis have 3 or 4, maybe even 5 trillion in treasury bonds. And I think part of the scummy, dirty deal set up by Kissinger as the Rockefeller agent with the Saudis was you sell oil in dollars and only dollars. We will require the whole world to do the same. And your bank reserves will be loaded with treasury bonds that you will not dump. So you receive treasuries for your oil and it never gets converted out of dollars. It stays in your banking system. That's going to be called the petrodollar system. And on a little side deal, we want you to buy boatloads of U.S. military weapons, and we will make sure that you have conflicts all over the place. Okay, that was the petrodollar deal. Okay, that's all pretty much dead. But part of that deal was you must fund the U.S. Department of Treasury Exchange Stabilization Fund. We need many years, several years to get the first trillion in there. And it's going to be Saudi property, Saudi asset, but it's going to live and stay under U.S. government control with the Department of Treasury and the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which has its mitts in just about every major financial market, bonds, stocks included, both. In the last 2 years, the Saudis have come to realize that their $3 trillion in treasury bonds they will never see again is too important as the core for the U.S. government's control center of financial markets. It's worse than that. All that UBS Swiss bank criminal charge nonsense, all that Credit Suisse bank criminal nonsense, all the U.S. government fines and fraud charges and income tax dodging charges and Iran sanction violation charges for UBS and Credit Suisse. It was all a smokescreen. I asked the same question as before. Since when does the U.S. government have jurisdiction over Swiss banks? They don't. So the Swiss are complicit. What were they doing? What was their project? Very simple. Get control of the Swiss banks, control the bullion banks, and steal Arab gold. So for the last 3 years, we've been sequestering and holding forever the Exchange Stabilization Fund of $3 trillion in treasury bonds and stealing the Arab gold, probably on the order of 1,000 tons. So the Saudis, if they have their eyes open, are realizing the U.S. is not our friend anymore. We're victims of their pilferage. So maybe that explains why they're attacking Qatar that has a government U.S. military facility there. Their action against Qatar could be an admission that they know the Americans are not their ally anymore, which makes the Trump visit and the billion-dollar golden sword all the more ludicrous. Boy, oh boy. I mean, every single U.S. foreign policy initiative is an utter joke and failure, full of lies, deceit, pilferage, and weapons movement. One of my simplest explanations of the weapons deal with the U.S. and Saudi was so that the U.S. could resupply ISIS. I mean, this is just ugly stuff, CJ.
Yeah, absolutely. And in regards to that, let's talk a little bit around the domestic dollar, gold-backed trade currency. What does that look like, and how will that affect America, Jim?
You mean the new Scheich dollar, the domestic-only dollar?
Correct, yes.
I gave it the name New Scheich dollar back in 2014, and I kind of chuckle every time I see it in some financial analyst's essay or other, public piece. It's a new dollar. It's not going to be connected to the old dollar. And it's a Scheich dollar because it's going to be recognized as a third world currency. Scheich is German for not just shit, but garbage, rubbish, flotsam, jetsam. Just discarded goods, discarded crap. That's German Scheich. So the new Scheich dollar. Okay, let me explain how I think it's going to come to be. If you look at the global reserve currency, and that whole structure has two sides. This is what the dollar is. It's a global reserve currency. And when it gets used, it's used as the global currency reserve, and it's the U.S. economy's currency. No other currency in the world has both distinctions. For a little while, the euro did. The euro was in banking systems as reserves. The euro was used, for instance, by Saddam in oil sales. So, that got halted quickly as the nation was declared a terrorist center and got invaded under false terms. The global currency reserve status and structure has two sides. Trade is settled in dollars, starting with oil, which is the biggest item in international trade. So, oil sales in treasury bills, grain, cement, coal, container vessels, they're settled in treasury bills. International consulting contracts, like between, say, India and Saudi, they're settled in U.S. dollars also. So international trade is settled in dollar payments. That's one side. The other side is banking reserves and asset management. Take, for instance, South Korea. I like them. They're a good example. They're not the biggest player in Asia, but they're a significant global exporter, and then they have surpluses. Their banking system is predominantly treasury bonds. And I think they're making moves toward Chinese government bonds and maybe quietly toward gold bullion, but who knows? Someday we might know. Usually those details and data are kept as trade secrets. The point is, banking systems in individual countries around the world are dominated in their core assets by treasury bonds. That's the way things have been now for 30, 40 years. So if a country like South Korea wants to pay for a big oil shipment coming from the Gulf or any other country, they quickly convert to treasury bills and pay in dollars, but in treasury bill form. Treasury bill, just a short-term treasury. Look at what the U.S. controls. The U.S. is much more in control of financial markets and military. So financial markets can dictate the value of the treasury bond. Just look at QE, look at derivatives like interest rate swaps, and they can bring about just about any bond yield that they want on the 10-year treasury. Anything they want. So movements, this is a joke of mine, but it's based in fact. Any movements in the treasury bond are the result of desires from insider trading. So they decide they want the 10-year to move from 1.8 to 2.6 in the next 6 months. So they put on their trades, they put on their big shorts, they put on their TNX trades, they put on options, they put on futures, and they put on futures options, and then they let it move according to how they push it. Okay, so the point is that the West, with the United States, controls the financial markets. They control the banking centers. They control SWIFT movements, bank transactions, country to country, bank to bank. So if the East, that is not fully in favor of the dollar anymore, wants to flex their muscles and bring about changes, they're not going to do it in the financial markets with the gold price or the treasury bond price or the S&P or the Apple share price or the Google share price, called Alphabet now. That's just a conglomerate that includes Google. So what would the Asian and Eastern nations use to change the status quo on the dollar with its global currency reserve status? They would use trade payments. And they would start to rumble and say, well, we got to deal with China and Brazil, and we're not going to use the dollar. We're going to use RMB, and Brazilians are all right with that, and they're going to just have a little bit more RMB usage in their banks. And of course, the United States can reply by saying, all right, we're going to have another small airplane crash, and it might be a central banker this time. That's how the U.S. operates, with all plausible deniability on the murder. We're using murder and war to defend the dollar. It's really quite sad and pathetic and tragic. So the Eastern nations are saying, we're not going to use the dollar as much anymore. So Russia and China have a huge, they call it the Holy Grail, energy deal back in 2015. It's continued. It's not off track. It's moving along. Pipeline construction, LNG construction. And the Chinese are buying Russian oil and gas and paying for it in RMB. They have de-dollarized. That was one of my other forecasts in 2015 with the Ukraine war. I said, look for the Eastern Hemisphere generally to get off the dollar payment system in trade, to de-dollarize. And that'll have an impact on their banking system when they realize they don't need to hold dollars if they're not going to use dollars in trade payment. Okay, so the Eastern nations are going to use their industrial power, which is not minor anymore. And as Howard Cosell might say, it's not insignificant anymore. The Eastern nations with the BRICS and the emerging market nations have a significant, not a dominant, but a significant industrial output now. They have a significant total GNP now, GDP, economic size. And they have a very dominant population size. Anytime you include China and India, you got over 2 billion in those two together just to start off with.
Massive.
Massive. So the Eastern nations are going to use the trade weapon to displace the dollar as the global currency reserve. And I think the starting point, as I said before, is going to be the Chinese paying for Saudi oil in RMB, and the other Arab nations are going to accept RMB, and the other Asian nations are going to choose to pay in RMB. That's a handful of nails in the petrodollar coffin. When that happens, the United States masters are going to have a wake-up call, and they're going to experience a shut door a little more often. It's going to sound like this. We're an Eastern producer. We export to the United States, and we no longer wish to receive treasury bills in payment. And the United States are going to say, well, we're going to shove them down your effing throat. And if you don't accept them, Korea, we're going to have a terrorist incident in Seoul, your capital. And we're going to blame it on Muslim terrorists, which we will hire. And the Eastern nations are going to say, well, okay, but we want some non-dollar payment. And compromises will be worked out. And eventually what you're going to get is more and more nations are going to refuse the treasury bills, and less volume internationally for U.S. imports are going to be conducted in treasury bills. And eventually the United States is going to realize we don't have the luxury anymore of this global currency reserve. We need something to guarantee imports to the U.S. economy, because we're getting besieged by 30 different countries who don't want the treasury bills any longer. And, we don't know how long we can fight them off. We don't know how long we can threaten them. We don't know how long we can, win compromises, but the trend is clear. The treasury bill is not going to be accepted much any longer. And then you start to see the shortages in the U.S. economy, the supply chain shortages, because plenty of countries will just not accept the treasury bill. They're going to look to export to China instead. They're going to look to export to Iran instead. They're going to look to export to India instead. And they're going to be just fine with those countries in RMB trade payment. And the U.S. government maestros are going to conclude, we need a new dollar. We need a domestic-only dollar that does not serve the dual function of global currency reserve for trade payment and bank reserves in foreign countries. We need a domestic-only dollar. Now, don't get confused by the name of domestic only. It's just a label. What it means is it's the country's special currency, and it's not used by any other country, and it's not used on an international trade tables either. But there'll be plenty of new shice dollars that are in hands in Mexico, in Europe, in London, in Canada. But it's going to be the domestic-only dollar. It'll be used to guarantee U.S. imports and to reduce the supply chain shortages. But when it comes, there's some that are saying that the Chinese and Americans have an agreement that's been in place now for a couple of years. The Chinese have told the Americans, prepare for your new dollar, your domestic only, because the dollar that's floating around in global circles cannot be used as your dollar anymore inside the United States because you're not paying your bills. You got a credit card that never has a reduced balance, and the balance now is over 20 trillion. And what they're quietly saying is, we don't want your dollar to be used internationally when you're using it to fund your militaries. You're attacking countries that are treasury bond investors. And the U.S. in the last 2 or 3 years had a very curious, intriguing response. Okay, we'll fund a military arm with mercenaries and we'll pay for it with heroin. What's the name of that, CJ?
Yep. ISIS.
ISIS. And we'll have plausible deniability, and we'll fund it through Saudis, and we'll arm it through Saudis and UAE. And we'll have the Mossad in Israel manage things. And for the longest time, the United States used the Ankara, Turkey, U.S. Embassy as the command and control center for all ISIS military logistics. But something went wrong, and the Turks decided that they didn't like it anymore. So the Turks were not our friends anymore, and we tried to direct a coup against their country. It failed, and the Russians came in and saved Erdogan's hide and his family. So now you're seeing lots of Turkish-Russian deals, including the Turkish Stream gas pipeline for Gazprom, which is a workaround to get around Ukraine. Oh my gosh, another failed. All right, so I got off the track. The United States is going to be forced to come up with a new domestic-only dollar, a new U.S. home dollar. And the talk between the Chinese and Americans was that it had to be devalued by 50% right away. And what I'm hearing from my contacts in the U.S. government was that a compromise was worked out where there would be 2 rapid 30% devaluations of the new Scheist dollar. Let's do some simple devaluation math. It's really, I'm grateful to a couple of clients who actually sent me a contact us email to make it so simple for my mind. If you do a 30% devaluation, you're preserving 70% of the value. You do another 30% devaluation, you preserve 70% of the 70%. In other words, you preserve 49%. There's your 51% devaluation. I'm thinking that we're going to announce a 30% devaluation out of the gate for the new Scheist dollar, and we're going to mix it in with some form of account confiscation, bank bail-ins. We're going to lie about the second devaluation. We're going to say, no, it's going to be fine now. It'll be the 30% deval, and that's going to be, it for a long, long time. And then in 3 to 6 months, there'll be another 3% devaluation because of necessity. Right. Okay, here's the other lie. The U.S. is going to say, this currency is sound. It is loaded with integrity. It will have global confidence because it is backed by gold and other resources like oil. But the gold is the deep storage gold myth, once again. Fort Knox has gold, but I'm told it has 1 or 2 barrels of coins valued somewhere under $2 billion. Okay, all the Fort Knox gold, once it was there, 8,700 tons, was worth on the order of $400 to $500 billion. That's all gone. Okay, so the gold will be the fictitious, falsified, deep storage gold bullshit. And what will the oil be? Well, the oil will be real, but it just won't be much in volume. I did a simple napkin math calculation and came up with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, CJ, was worth a cool $7 billion.
Wow.
So if we have a trade deficit of $500 billion, we need 70 Strategic Petroleum Reserves to forfeit. Okay, so other simple napkin math is if you take like a $1,300 gold price, the $500 billion trade deficit translates to over 10,000 tons of gold every year.
Amazing.
So Would you think that it's an appropriate name to call the new Scheist dollar a third world currency?
Basically, yes.
Basically, yeah. All right. Now, we got the underpinnings of the new Scheist dollar. We got its usages. We have its phony backing or inadequate backing, inadequate and phony backing. What will be the consequences? It will be a severe price inflation, sudden, for all imports. That Toyota car that was 25,000, no, it sits a little bit more now. It's like, if you have a 30% deval, it's about a 40% increase in price. So think of it as 25,000 times 40 to 10, a $35,000 Toyota instead of 25. Maybe $35,000, $36,000, $37,000 instead of 25. And what's going to be really interesting is that we're going to hear a lot, I mentioned this in other interviews, we're going to hear a lot about Buy American. I mean, now that we have our own dollar, let's buy American and help reduce the trade deficit. But the problem is so much more thorny than it sounds. Imagine just, the big three U.S. automakers. Well, for the longest time, especially under Iacocca, Chrysler was bringing in a lot of Mitsubishi engines.
Correct, yes.
So the debate is going to be over buying American cars, and then the problem revealed will be all the foreign-made components that are subject to higher prices. I'm not certain, but I believe Ford has the lowest import components. If that's true, and I'm not certain of that, if that's true, Ford will see the lowest increases on its prices from the new Scheist dollar. And if Chrysler is still importing a large amount of components, then Chrysler cars will see the biggest price increases as a result of the new Scheist dollar introduction. Now turn to agriculture, food supply. When I was a kid, the United States was importing a very small, like 10, 15% of food. And, it was kind of like cool stuff, like, coffee from Colombia and chili peppers from Mexico and jalapenos. Okay, fine. When I was in graduate school, I used to notice, oh my gosh, look at that. Here we are in January, and it's a funny looking tomato. And look at closely, and there's a little sticker on it saying from Chile. And then I started reading Wall Street Journal and Barron's a little bit more when I was in my first job in the 80s. And I realized, oh my gosh, the United States is very close to importing 50% of its food. And now we're importing more than 50% of our food. So the general food costs will see a near doubling. I'm sorry. Let me say that differently. I got that wrong. The food costs that are subject to imports will see a near doubling. And the general food bill will see a roughly 50% increase because tomatoes are coming from South America, onions are coming from Mexico. The new Scheist dollar took a 30% hit versus all of them. And everything we import costs more. Now mix your shopping basket with all those import items with the domestic produced items. It's about half-half. So the impact will be about half on the new Scheist dollar devaluation. Oh my gosh. You're going to see price increases everywhere. At the same time, many countries that broke away from the U.S. on exporting to the U.S. because they were bickering over the Treasury bill, they didn't come back. So you have some supply shortages. Price increases, supply shortages, and riots. That's going to be social disorder is a nice way that the press likes to prefer putting it. They don't like to say riots in America are coming. No, they're going to say social disorder from angst over increase in prices that are going to all be Russia's fault. The dog ate my homework. It's the Russians' fault. Yeah, right. Take a close look at the Russians' fault, and you find the Clintons' fraudulent activity and bribery and the Clinton Foundation fraudulent activity with murders, all linked with Russian activity. Not the murders, just the activity. All right, so the impact to the U.S. consumer is going to be gigantic. They're going to be told that it's going to be a salvation. The reality is it's going to be an open door to the third world. Big price increases, in noticeable shortages, and where will the riots take place? At the gas stations, at the supermarkets for food, and the ATM centers for cash, because there will be less cash.
Agree. I completely agree, Jim. In regards to that, in terms of this world that's being completely rearranged away from the U.S. dollar. In your opinion, is that what we're witnessing in terms of the deep state in regards to Trump? And will Trump, what will they use as a reason or an excuse for this happening? Obviously, they're not going to take responsibility for the demise of the dollar. Will there be escalation in North Korea, perhaps Ukraine, a Syria flare-up? What will they blame this on?
Well, to begin with, the deep state is pushing the U.S. government in a way to try to bring the rest of the world to heel, bring them under command, put them on a leash. And one country after another, starting with the East, said no. And now Germany in the West is saying no. So my catchphrase is that the U.S. government is going to begin to sanction a lot of different countries, and the result is that they're going to sanction pretty much the rest of the world and win isolation. If the Germans embrace Russia more with trade, finance, and development, technology sharing, that sort of thing, it's going to be a blow to the U.S. The Germans are going to say, well, with all the actions that are underhanded and heavy-handed and all the nonsense from Washington, we're going to do less trade. We're going to tolerate less trade with the United States because we're going to make up for it with China and Russia and the East, the Eurasian trade zone, the development of Thailand, the development of Kazakhstan. Okay, these are not countries in the Wall Street Journal publications. The U.S. is going to win isolation by continued pressure and trade sanctions. The U.S. is going to win isolation by conducting the deep state's agenda of chemtrails, GMO seeds, fracking of oil, and laced vaccines. And when the failure comes, that's going to be most noted with the new Scheisse dollar, the United States is going to need a fall guy. They're going to need a scapegoat. They're going to need the blame game to go into hyperdrive. And I think they're going to blame Russia, China, and Syria. Syria is going to be the fall guy for the Arab world. I mean, it might be the Saudis that betrayed us, but we're going to blame Syria. Now, as for Trump, this is going to sound like a very funny statement to make, but I'm just going to say it. Trump is becoming more and more an irrelevant figure as the days pass, as the months pass. You can focus on, the Trump-Russia connection all you want, but all you're doing is proving you're an idiot. The connection between Russia is with the Clintons and the Clinton Foundation. The bribe money, the trade money, the uranium deals, it's all with Russia and the Clintons. So if you want to focus on Trump and Russia, you're proving you're an idiot, and you're proving that you swallow the nonsense from the New York Times and the CNN factories like a moron. Now, is the deep state moving against Trump? I don't know. I don't care. When the Trump administration announces something, I used to be in favor of Trump when he got elected because he had a pretty interesting agenda, and I don't see a single item on his agenda being followed. I do see potential traps built by Trump so that his enemies would fall into them. And if he is in control of those traps and designs those traps, then my hat's off to him as a very clever move. If Trump, for instance, wanted to defuse the Russian factor by pushing Germany into closer trade unity with Russia, then he's a master tactician. But I'm not sure whether it was a Trump active action or a passive action. And I don't care. I pay less and less attention now to Trump and the administration and decisions made, just like I did with Obama. Obama was an irrelevant mouthpiece for the deep state. He never made a decision. His Obamacare was an insurance company sector devised ploy. I don't pay attention to the Trump administration. Okay, when you have all these shuffling of people in chairs and posts, and the only thing I've paid attention to recently is how the Department of State seems to have been dismissed by Trump. I don't mean one or two, I mean the whole damn lot. And now it seems like we have a hidden Department of State that doesn't report to Congress anymore. I mean, the U.S. government is becoming a joke. I don't pay much attention to what the Congress does because it usually is centered on Russia, which has been proved not to be dealing with Trump, but to have been dealing with the Clintons.
Correct, yes.
So the Congress is irrelevant. The Trump administration is irrelevant. The Saudi arms deal was irrelevant. Nothing that either the executive or the legislative branches do is relevant. So I'm paying more attention to important things, like the Saudis winning the right to pay for the Chinese winning the right to pay for Saudi oil in RMB. I'm looking at important things, like the Germans moving closer to Russia and ignoring sanctions. Pardon me. I'm looking at important things. Pardon me. I have to cough, CJ. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Yep, absolutely. No, and it's very interesting to point that out. Just in regards to Obama, I completely agree in terms of that he was just a figurehead, and you look at his actions; they were completely decided, by other, with Syria, everything else involved. Jim, in terms of your thoughts, any closing thoughts you'd like to share, with our listeners, just want to kind of open the floor for you to discuss anything else or any closing thoughts, please.
I have some closing thoughts regarding gold and silver as it relates to the new Scheist dollar and as it might relate to the new cryptocurrencies. They're not so new anymore. They've been around for several years. When the new Scheist dollar comes into play, it will be quite clear that there's a void in the global currency structures. For instance, people are going to start asking, what's the backing of the ruble? Well, it's probably their oil industry, but they also have significant gold reserves that they've been lying about. They have a lot more than they claim. When people ask, what's behind the Chinese RMB currency, the yuan? People are going to say, well, it's their industrial sector that's quite significant. It's their demand center from the growing middle class. Their middle class is bigger than the United States population. The Chinese have more people with the name of Chen, Cheng, Chuang, Chung, and Sang. Okay, all derivations of the name Chen, which is a derivation of the word king. They have more derivations of Chen than there are American citizens. Okay? The backing of the Chinese currency is their industrial sector, their middle class, and their gigantic gold reserves, which they've been lying about. The Russians and the Chinese each have over 25,000 tons of gold. They're not going to tell us how much they have. Chinese did something very clever a couple months ago. They said they're going to shut down marginal gold mines and begin to import more gold. No, let's translate that. The Chinese are going to continue with their gold mining, but the central bank and the sovereign wealth centers and the elite are going to buy that domestic gold production and take it off the market and force more imports to help break the Western stranglehold on the gold market. Okay, there are going to be more questions about what's going to be behind the euro. I was just told by a good, reliable client that what I had been describing as a Nordic euro is starting to come into view. But it will not be the Nordic euro. It will be the countries that I thought were going to be behind the Nordic euro, namely Germany, Austria, Netherlands, and Finland. They're all printing up their old currency. They're printing up currencies to replace the euro. They're going to adopt their old currencies. The Germans are printing new Deutschmarks. And the beauty of this, and the link with the old, my claim back in 2011 and 12 of the Nordic euro coming to pass, I thought it was going to be a gold-backed Nordic euro with those same four countries. But instead what you're going to get is those four countries are going to revert to their old currencies, and they're going to link themselves together. And the indication, this is confirmed by the same source, the indication, this is not, rock solid, is that those four countries are going to link themselves together with the future expectation of backing those four currencies with gold. And they're going to create a Central European monetary union. It's for Central Europeans and their stable economies, excluding the pigs, excluding Portugal, excluding Italy, excluding Greece, excluding Spain. Gold will be behind it eventually. I think the Chinese are going to announce a gold-backed RMB currency, and the Russians will be right behind them, a gold-backed ruble, while they're not using the dollar in trade payments or banking any longer. So this multi-year, I hate to call it a bear market, but decline from the 1900 level in 2011, which was largely engineered by the Swiss with their Swiss franc euro peg and the hidden component. It was really a Swiss franc euro and dollar triangle peg that punished gold. It wasn't just a franc euro peg at 120. It was a franc euro dollar peg that worked to bring down the gold price. Okay, that's going to be reversed. The Swiss are now in such deep shit. They're holding way, way too many euros in the Swiss National Bank. The Swiss are holding way too many U.S. stocks. They thought that they'd get some appreciation, not hold a dead asset like the Treasury bond. Ooh, a dead asset. No, it's not only dead, it's toxic. If I were to say to you back in the 80s, CJ, there's going to come a time in the future when the U.S. government is running trillion-dollar deficits. Ho, 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 what a joke, Jim. That'll never happen. Yes, it did. And they're going to print money to monetize it and call it stimulus with quantitative easing, which is what the Japanese did. Ho, 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 that'll never happen in the United States. Well, it's happening. It's happening now, and there's all kinds of deceit, fraud at work to support the dollar, and war to support the dollar. False cause of war with Iran. I mean, Tony Blair in England is now in hot water for the whole false cause of war for Iraq, 2003. And let me make a couple last closing comments. I am no expert in the cryptocurrencies with Bitcoin and et cetera, Ethereum and all these. I'm not an expert, but I have begun my little project, my little education process. I have invited 3 or 4 smart colleagues and clients to assist me and to engage in conversation and pass information, pass me a video, pass me an article, pass me an interview, like with Nick Szabo, who's a principal player in the development and the design of cryptocurrencies with encryption and smart contracts, etc. I'm going to include them, the cryptocurrencies in development and impact with both finance and economics, commerce. I'm going to include them in the hat trick letter starting this month. But let me say this. The cryptocurrencies are decentralized, and the Rothschild central bank system doesn't like that. The cryptocurrencies allow for passage, transfer of funds across borders without approval or ferryman fees by the central banks. And the Rothschild central bank system doesn't like that. The cryptocurrencies are finding themselves more lodged within the blockchain, which is essentially a very secure and stable linkage of contracts and activity and payments that has the potential for, I won't say completely, but virtually eliminating fraud. And eventually, we might see soon the Chinese announcing a gold trade note, gold put up as equity and on margin to facilitate a payment for, say, oil from the Gulf region. And the gold trade note will have gold put up as its core. And the big question remains is, where's the gold going to exist? Who will control it? Who will assure its existence? Who will manage the equity placements, etc.? A lot of questions. But I think gold is going to find a marriage with the cryptocurrencies. I have a big question. When a coin is mined for Bitcoin, where did it come from? And I hear electronic work. Oh, and that's fine, because electronic work is a whole lot more valid than where did that new dollar come that the Fed just created.
Exactly.
It came from a keystroke on a computer approved by the central bank head and the board. Okay, well, as far as I know, we haven't created $24 trillion in cryptocurrencies like the Fed created in 08 and 09 for the Fed owners at near 0% to buy up the global assets after they crashed the system. So cryptos fare much better than existing currencies, and they're exciting. I find the whole blockchain to be exciting, and one of the really good examples I have of where the blockchain might have been a tremendous enhancement is for the MERS, MERS. It's the Mortgage Electronic Registry System that was used as a title database between 2001 and 2008 when it crashed. The whole system crashed. Well, the MERS title database was where, okay, let me give you an example. Morgan Stanley created a mortgage bond, and they wanted to use the secure stream from 100 mortgages. So they appealed to the MERS stream, grabbed the titles off the 100 mortgages, put those into the mortgage bond, declared bond, and everything was happy and everything was fine, and they sold the bond on the market, and the brokers made their nice fees, and another bond was born. But unfortunately, Goldman Sachs made another mortgage bond where of those 100 that were on Morgan Stanley's, 30 also appeared in Goldman Sachs and their mortgage bond. So they used duplicate fashion, the income secure stream in fraudulent fashion. Okay, if MERS had been set up as a blockchain for a secure string of contracts and title securitization and payments, the fraud would have been discovered in a matter of days. Instead, the MERS fraud turned out to be a multiple trillion-dollar fraud that helped to bring down the Western banking system. Okay, blockchain would have put out of business the fraudulent mortgage bond brokers in Wall Street. This is the threat coming. The blockchain and smart contracts with the tokens behind them. I'm not an expert in this, but I'm getting more exposure and knowledge. And I have a lot of questions still. I'm getting help. I admit my shortcomings, but I claim a little bit of knowledge now. After not a whole lot of time of learning, but learning from smart teachers. Okay, if the blockchain with smart contracts and encryption and logged in payments, if all this can be created and get adopted and thrive and spread, we're going to see a gigantic threat to the fraud masters in Wall Street banking and finance. This is what they fear. They fear honesty, integrity, and the building of the magic word trust. Because there's no trust in Wall Street, there's no trust in the bonds, whether mortgage bonds, they include fraudulent car secure streams for loans. There's no trust in treasury bonds with the fabricated bond demand coming from interest rate swap derivatives. There's no trust in the dollar. That's why the Eastern nations are working out alternatives, forcing the U.S. to come up with a domestic-only dollar. So I think we're going to see a marriage of some of the commercial methods and platforms in blockchain and cryptocurrencies, a marriage with precious metals. And the reason is simple. Sound contracts, honest contracts, are going to merge with sound money and honest money. This is coming, and anyone who thinks, oh gosh, I got to get rid of my gold, it's done nothing recently, oh boy, your timing just could not be worse. We have now many currencies that are in breakout mode in a minor way, breaking north of a downtrend. All 5 BRICS currencies, Brazil, India, Russia, China, and South Africa, all 5 of their currencies are breaking north of a downtrend. That's amazing because, little South Africa, what a little shit country that's turned out to be. Under, what's his name, Zuma?
Yep.
What a joke. And what a joke India has become with their pressure to monetize the temple gold, with their attempts to abolish cash. Unilaterally abolish the high denomination rupee currency bill and declare it worthless. My gosh, it's just amazing that Modi, their prime minister, is still around. Okay, so the general comments, CJ, are that the changes are coming very rapidly, and so are the breakdowns. Take a look at Cliff High and his oh gosh, what's the name of his? I can't think. Half Past Human.
Yes.
Half Past Human. His linguistics analysis. It's not so much forecast as it is dominant themes that are appearing. And they're meaningful. It doesn't make them forecasts. They could be sidetracked. He's now just getting on the stump saying, we've got breakdown everywhere you turn. And it's in the linguistics. It's in the language of the internet and email. Okay, so the breakdowns are happening. The financial breakdowns are happening. The market rigging is still very strong, but its breakdown, I think, will happen. And the winner is going to be gold, sound money, and silver, sound money. Whatever happens with gold, silver will tag along. Whatever gains gold has, silver's going to at least double the gains. So if gold goes up, 40% in the next 2 years, silver's going to go up 80 to 100%. These are exciting times, CJ, and we're just starting now. The big moves in the paradigm shift. Paradigm's not just a cool word with a silent G. It means that the reset, the global currency reset is coming. The global paradigm shift is coming. It's very near. It's not years away. It's months away. The global paradigm shift is for the East to take its place in global leadership with banking, finance, economic, and industry. Big changes are coming. And with the changes, the U.S. is going to find itself more isolated and at the risk of falling into the third world if they don't do some things very rapidly and effectively, namely reindustrialize. The most suicidal event I've ever seen in my adult life watching economics has been outsourcing of U.S. industry. I said back in the late 80s to good friends of mine, we're giving up legitimate income. What are we going to replace it with? And I heard everywhere, the finance sector is going to become dominant. Financial engineering. How'd that turn out? It broke down with fraud and just asset bubbles that burst everywhere. Okay. Well, thanks for having me on, CJ, and I hope people can go to www.goldenjackass.com, check out the free area. It's the main HTL page, and there's a lot of other interviews, links to them, public articles, links to them. But it's the home of the hat-trick letter that comes in the form of 2 monthly reports, the Global Money War Report and the Golden Currency Report. And I hope people go there and sign up for the newsletter, because we are on the cusp of unbelievable, powerful changes that have been building and have been interrupted by things like the Ukraine war and the Syrian war. The longer those wars are at a standoff, the closer we are to realizing the major global paradigm shifts.
Couldn't agree more. So, Jim, want to thank you for a wonderful interview. And again, this is CJ with Rogue Money, and joined today with Jim Willie. So, great interview, Jim, and appreciate your time.
Okay, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you.